a victory today for reporters and activists fighting the controversial indefinite detention law. A federal judge has ruled that the government cannot enforce a provision that allows the military to detain those who support terrorists and associated forces. And those two words, associated forces, are key. That's because the plaintiffs in the case against the government, a group of 7 reporters and activists, say they believe they may fall under this category by reporting on the Middle East. They say under the NDAA, they could be indefinitely detained because their jobs sometimes require them to interact with terrorists. Now, the judge granted a temporary injunction back in May. That put a temporary block on that law, but federal judge Catherine Forrest has now made that order permanent. I'm joined now by Tangerine Bolin, the founder and director of Revolution Truth. Tangerine, welcome. So first want to ask you the significance of this ruling, not just for you and the plaintiffs, but for the American people.
Well, it's significant for all of us and actually for anyone on this planet because no one anywhere at this point can be indefinitely detained under the NDAA.
All right. I mean, I guess that just sums it up there. I do want to read, though, a quote from Judge Catherine Forrest's ruling. It states, quote, "Due deference does not eliminate the judicial obligation to rule on the properly presented constitutional questions. Courts must safeguard core constitutional rights. A long line of Supreme Court precedent adheres to that fundamental principle in unequivocal language." So, Tangerine, I want to ask you to talk more about what parts of this law raised questions of constitutionality.
Well, she addressed that pretty strongly with a couple points yesterday, actually a lot of points. And 2 of them are, firstly, that several of the terms you mentioned, one of them associated forces, material support, independent journalism, which was newly introduced, that those remain vague and the government either could not or would not define those for us. That's actually unconstitutional, according to Judge Forrest's ruling yesterday. It runs counter to the due process clause of the First Amendment. So they have to define their terms, and she told them that yesterday in no uncertain terms in that ruling. Secondly, the government has tried to claim repeatedly that the court should only intervene with a habeas review, not judicial review. What that means is you've already lost your rights to due process if the government gets its way, and the best you can hope for if you're indefinitely detained is that someone somewhere down the line demands a habeas review and demands that you're brought before the court. So she said, no, absolutely not. It's my duty. It's our duty to step in and say due process is guaranteed by the Constitution.
So a big victory for you. We also had one of the plaintiffs, Chris Hedges, on the show to talk about what you were just discussing. Let's take a listen to what he had to say.
It removes due process for anybody who is deemed not just a terrorist, but to have contact with these associated forces. That's not a term that's defined. It's nebulous. It's quite a frightening piece of legislation.
Okay, so now that the judge has ruled, put in this permanent injunction and has made it so that part of the law cannot be enforced, are you now comfortable with the NDAA, the law as it stands now?
Well, I was thrilled for the last 24 hours, but just before we got on this call today, they actually appealed the ruling. So in 24 hours, the government appealed the ruling that occurred yesterday. So I would say that I do still feel a measure of anxiety because we obviously have a battle ahead of us. We're going into the Second Circuit now, which very likely means we're going to the Supreme Court. That's worrisome. And obviously we want and need a win for all of us. So it's been a roller coaster over the last 24 hours.
And that, of course, is the latest development in this story. A lot of twists and turns. You had the temporary injunction. The judge ruled that it's now permanent. A huge victory for you now that the government is trying to repeal that. I mean, how confident are you now that you will ultimately be able to prevail in this?
Well, I really have a lot of confidence that we have a chance at prevailing in this. I really believe in the power of the people to come forward and restore justice and due process and our fundamental rights all around. So I think it's critical that we fight and we not give up. And so I'm hopeful. I'm worried about this appeal, but the judge's ruling yesterday was an incredibly strong ruling, and hopefully future judges will also agree with that.
And you had mentioned how this is a very important case for everybody, for all Americans, particularly the plaintiffs in this case. They were reporters and a lot of activists. What does this mean for people like you, for reporters, for journalists that are worried that their freedom of speech was at risk because of this law?
Well, I have 2 points to respond to that, actually. One, I want to dispel a myth that this applies more to us than it does to other citizens. It's not just applying to journalists and activists. It applies to everybody. So let's be perfectly clear about that, because that's great news. Secondly, however, my work and the work of the other journalists and activists in our group, it does bring us in contact with people that have been identified as terrorists by the United States government. And that's a huge concern when the government attorneys actually in court stated on the record that even war correspondents and journalists could be indefinitely detained for exercising First Amendment rights. That's hugely worrisome. We need to be able to do our jobs.
All right. And of course, this is a lot of new developments in this case. It's a very important case with very significant ramifications. Do you think that it is getting enough attention in the media?
I think after yesterday, we've gotten more attention in the last 24 hours than we have this entire 5 or 6 months. So that's been great. However, I would also say that, yes, we need a lot more attention. We need the national media to really take up this story and bring it to the public, so the public knows what we're up against and that we're working so hard to restore our rights.
All right. Well, it looks like your hard work is paying off, because it looks like you're getting the support of the judge there in the district judge, Judge Forrest. Tangerine, really great to have you on the show. That was Tangerine Boland, the founder and director of Revolution Truth.